Loring, thank you. Loring has given me an incredibly small and easy topic, and I think I have 19 minutes in which to solve it. So I think we can, get it perfectly wrapped up. I just want to build on that line. It might have been you, sir, that said that we pay for the things that we value, and that's a big part of why I'm here. And our role in these worlds is going to expand, and so that's just something I want to briefly share. I work for the McCormick Philanthropies. We're based in Chicago. Loring, thanks again for having us. It's serendipitous that Loring and I reconnected in this moment. I just moved back to the New York office from 6 years in Los Angeles, and this is a really vital and I think comparatively very underfunded essential component of our cultural ecosystem. So I'm speaking, I hope, sort of not just on behalf of our organization, but on behalf of the broader philanthropic community about just how urgent this support is. I hope I come bearing a little bit of good news. And I just want to give a very brief, by way of introduction, little history of the work that we do. So if that name rings any kind of bell, we've been granting since the 1870s. The endowments are derived from two companies. One was a tractor company called International Harvester, which no one in this room is old enough to remember what that was. But the second was the Tribune and Tribune Publishing, which was Newsday here in New York, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times. So we have been at this intersection of democracy promotion, the fostering of civic fabrics, and the dissemination of public ideas since the 1950s. A couple of examples. Our Chicago Public radio stations all over the United States. We gave a grant to a sort of obscure Episcopalian priest from Western Pennsylvania who became Mr. Rogers. PBS Frontline, which just won an Oscar, which is really great from those guys. And then the sort of world of small magazines, Lingua Franca, Cabinet Magazine, some of you probably have loved in previous years, and the Medill School of Journalism in Northwestern. It's a proudly long list. Actually, just last year we gave a grant to Maggie Nelson. Someone just name-checked Maggie Nelson, which felt really good too. So we're trying to foster some kind of public commons, and I think judging by the state of public awareness and discourse, I would not say we're doing a particularly good job, but we're going to keep trying. And then, of course, just in the arts, we've also been involved in the arts for a zillion years. And there has been sort of overlap between journalism and the arts. I think of the Astor Gates's project around Ebony and Jet, which we were proud to support. So that's sort of kind of archival, a little bit of both. For the purposes of today, I want to talk about the scaffolding of a new silo of funding, which is exactly to bolster the work of the previous panel's participants, and that is in arts journalism and in arts criticism. And I think everyone has been waiting on the foundation side for some kind of silver bullet, some kind of superstructure before we had the bravery to fund, because I think, especially with the obsession with metrics, there's always this idea that you're just giving a grant out into the wilderness, and how is it going to build up on itself? And so we've really taken a step back from that, which has maybe come a little bit late, but better late than never. There really isn't a day that goes by when there isn't some foreboding headline. Someone just mentioned Carolina Miranda, and I just learned this morning that also Justin Chang left the LA Times, which is also not super surprising, but a little sad for my beloved Los Angeles. So as this delta between the resources and the need just continues to grow exponentially, we're going to continue to step in and try to do our little role in filling that breach. So what we're going to do, and part of why I'm here is really as much to learn as to share, is we're going to have a silo that's 7 figures a year for likely 15 years, and it'll be in support of exactly this kind of arts journalism and arts criticism. The grants are open to any form of writing, any kind of coverage, any kind of production. Print, online, podcast, fortune cookie, Laserdisc. We're going to be open-minded. The focus will be on edited long form and investigatory arts criticism. And it'll be open to both individuals and to organizations, with a concentration on organizations that are a little scrappier with annual budgets, about 1 to 2 would be my guess. So we welcome your feedback. I'm sure many of you have ideas. You certainly have recommendations. Half of what we do in New York is just stealing ideas from Loring, so I'm happy to steal ideas from all of you. Foundations we're a little bit like these old battleships. We can carry a lot of weight, but we don't turn very quickly. So there's been a couple constraints. One is this idea of tactility. We're one of these old things from when the internet came in the mail. We're from newspapering. And so for us, it took us a long minute to support anything that wasn't printed, that we couldn't archive, that we couldn't really feel. We took a big step back away from that in the 90s. And then, again, to mention metrics, this second issue of stickiness, I think a lot of foundations are gun shy because they go, well, I don't know how many people are going to see this, and I don't know how it's going to last. I don't know how it's going to be circulated, although, of course, all of that can be reliably tracked. But I think in the competition for resources that is every foundation meeting, there is a limited budget, even though foundations are sort of lying and playing poor when their endowments are exploding. But we still have to make decisions. And so for us to focus on arts criticism, we had to kind of walk away from those two tightly held beliefs. And we're doing this for two sort of reasons that are going to be pretty obvious to this audience, maybe less so to some of the other groups that I get to speak to. And one is just the centrality of arts criticism to larger debates in both politics and economics. And again, that's not a surprise to anyone here. But when I worked for the government for 11 years, and when I wanted to get a pulse of the kind of domestic political environment, I would not historically turn to the arts section. You would always have organizations like ACT UP that would combine activism in the arts. But I think it's fair to say nothing like we're finding today, where a lot of these third spaces and museums are becoming the first place that the activist community is going to, which is really exciting. But you also need a particular journalistic background and understanding to cover that, to participate in that. And then I think economically, again, so we're headquartered in Chicago. If you had told me that the next kind of blossoming of the labor debate would be at the Art Institute and at the MCA, I just maybe wouldn't have taken that seriously. So again, I think these are topics that journalists can certainly cover, but I think can be covered more in depth by people who have feet in both of those worlds. And then I just want to say, as a lot of what's tough about, I say it as though I know, but a lot of what's tough, I think, about being one of these panelists is there's this idea that it's sort of important, but it's elite and it's kind of esoteric. And I'm always the first to point out that work is a huge economic force multiplier. It's not only a feedback system for our creative community, but it's a way of directing assets and resources and attention to cultural properties. And part of why Loring and I were trading notes is when I moved to Los Angeles 6 years ago, I didn't know Hawthorne from Glendale, and actually Carolina Miranda was one of the first people I called, and she not only directed me to museums I would have never found, the California African American Museum, I didn't know what that was, but to a lot of things that are not in the arts, in meds and eds, which are our principal areas that I also, again, probably wouldn't have found. So we feel a little belated, we feel a little behind, we're kind of on the back foot, but we want to extend that support. I think we always drew, I feel strangely confessional, we always drew a line between journalists and artists. And we sort of thought, well, artists are these freelancers and the precarity is kind of obvious, but journalists are attached to these institutions, some of which are very large, and if that doesn't work, they'll go somewhere else. And I think we're seeing that through new eyes. And we're realizing just how precarious their situation is too. especially in the last couple of years when that panic post-COVID is really accelerating. So in closing, I just want to say we're really excited to spend, we've started doling it out last December, but this year is really going to be a learning year. And we're going to be meeting with people and going on site visits and following recommendations. And I'm just very sympathetic. I was in a previous life, I was the publisher of The Baffler, and I remember we got a grant once for $5,000, and I remember thinking, oh, well, all of our problems are over. That's, and so I've been on both sides, and I know some of the feelings. For the rest of the year, I'm going to steal this from Jerry, and I'm going to say, that's my non-presentation, and I'm sorry. And then I'm going to ask for questions. Please. Shout it out. Please. Are we funding nonprofits only? We're not funding for-profits. We'll fund individuals who don't necessarily have to be associated with a nonprofit, but we're not going to be funding for-profits. In a deeply surreal moment, the owners of the Tribune tried to figure out a way for the foundation that was begat from the Trib to buy it back, and that's something and to turn that into a not-for-profit. So that's something we've been trying to figure out. But in terms of supporting, maybe we should. I mean, I'll be honest, that honestly hadn't really occurred to me, but I mean, maybe, thank you. But no, I think in our original estimation, no, but here we go, yeah. What did you have in mind? What would be a good example?
Well, furthering to the point or the question I had for the panel, there's the media landscape is in tremendous shift and change, and a lot of gallerists are starting their own publications and funding writers that are probably going to be on your grantee list to write for publications or to dig into topics and artists that aren't getting the clickbait but are very, very valid and very important and relevant to today's cultural landscape. So I was just sort of thinking through, and I know like our organization, a lot of our organizations like ours, are also setting up editorial platforms to kind of compensate for what's not being covered, but we are all for profits. So I just was curious about that.
Yeah, there's such an interesting melding too. A great example, again, going back to my days with The Baffler and N+1, is the sort of acquisition, if that's the right word, of The Drift magazine by Zwirner Galleries. And again, that was not a situation that I remember existing when I was in publishing. I'm certain that some kind of hybrid of, as has always been the case, of the public and private is probably going to be the way forward. Yeah, but it's a huge thing. That's why we need to. It's a big thing to bite off. That's why we need all the input we can get.
I have a question.
Please.
How does it work? Like, how do you give grants out? Do people apply? Do you handpick people? Can you walk us through that process?
Sure. So the thing to do is to email Loring Randolph at vassar.edu and to email really every 25 or 30 minutes, because that way it's every time I open and at night too, because that's when I'm most focused. There is an over the transom way, although that's not probably going to be. A lot of it is word of mouth, and we rely on often previous grantees who give us recommendations. It's going to take me a while to kind of relearn the landscape here in New York. We've got a decent team that's, but so a lot of it, I think. A lot of people in the foundation world want to give this impression that, we have some kind of genius master list and we have this 50-year plan. It's just not true. Sometimes people will mention something at a conference or mention it in an elevator, and then I go back and do my diligence. But for the purposes of this group, you can reach out to me, because I think probably half of you run the organizations that I'm going to be calling. But otherwise, it won't be over the transom because we are trying to keep it much more focused. If that makes, is that a good answer to your question?
Yep.
Okay.
Is it possible for you to give people an idea of the amount of money that you have to give annually?
Sure. It'll be, that's a great question. It'll be 7 figures a year, so the average grant will be probably 50 to 100. But again, all of that is based on, I should also add, which again is such a assumed caveat, it won't necessarily be indicative of performance. And again, I think that's something that foundations have really struggled with in this area, where you say, well, if X number of people have been going to the Triple Canopy website on March, then Y number need to go by December. And I think that's really limited our ability to be supportive, because that's just not how it works. And so as you kind of go around the room and say, well, I want this for meds and eds, I want this for scholarship, and I want this for the arts, and it was hard for arts programs officers to say, well, I can back up the data on this. And so I'm very admiring of my colleagues for taking that step back and saying, this is not the right way to look at the success of this work. And it's, yeah. So we're open to organizations that really are growing and experimenting and trying something. And I think that work speaks for itself. I don't think it has to, I think I'm going to assume that's a deep frustration of the panel, is that you put out something amazing and then everybody sort of goes, okay, but what's the impact and who read it? And that's not historically what arts criticism has been for. At least I don't think. Yeah.
Any other questions? You can feel free to swarm him afterwards. Oh, here we
Exactly.
Focusing, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Are you focusing on the United States or also internationally?
That's a great question. We do give internationally, but not for this. This will be principally domestic. But that's a really smart question. And I would say there's been rightly so, there's been an obsession with foundations of finding somebody like in eastern Montana who covers X, Y, and Z, and that's great. We do a lot of that. But I think somebody just said something like, the majority of people who work in this world live within 6 miles of where I'm standing. And I think that's also okay to acknowledge, and that's also a force multiplier too. So I think probably 60% will be dispersed within my kind of 360 eye line. So it not only will it not be international, it might be somewhat sort of New York centric. Yeah. Which is one of those things you're not really supposed to say out loud, but thankfully we're not recording this, so it's okay. Track me down. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Conor.
Thank you.